Good morning, everyone. My name is Vince Iluzzi, former state senator from the Essex-Orleans District in the Northeast Kingdom. And with me today is former Senator Jim Leddy, also Senator Tanya Vahosky from the Chittenden North District, and Representative Kate Logan. We are here today to request that Governor Phil Scott declare an emergency akin to an emergency that would be declared following any disaster because of the homelessness crisis that is being faced by everyone in all communities around Vermont. We are here today to add our voice to the growing call for emergency action on the homelessness crisis in our communities. The Vermont Constitution vests authority in the governor to declare a state of emergency. No other person in the state of Vermont can declare a state of emergency. The homelessness crisis should be treated like a disaster for the same reasons the state declared a disaster following the devastating major floods in July 2023 and again earlier this year. This is a statewide disaster. The time to urgently act is today. The legislative process is not equipped to respond to emergencies, and the homelessness crisis is an ongoing emergency, just as was the flooding that hit Vermont over the past 2 years. As time passes and more homeless individuals die or suffer both the short and long-term consequences of homelessness, it is not acceptable for the governor to either blame the legislature or to continue with business as usual. The plight of homeless Vermonters, adults, children, and the elderly has been overshadowed by complaints about high property taxes and economic development. However, if you stop and think about it for a moment, not addressing homelessness is costing the state and local communities millions of dollars. Consider the impact on our schools. There are stories of children living with little or no shelter, going to school, more worried about being clothed, eating, and staying warm than they are about learning. Of the children who do make it to school, some don't want to leave the school building at the end of the day because they have no home to which they can or want to return. The homelessness crisis will not go away on its own. It has been present. It is present. If you want to make Vermont more affordable, the necessary place to start is to address the cost to state and local governments, not only in financial terms, but on societal terms, the impact on our society caused by the homelessness crisis. I'd like to now turn it over to one of my former colleagues, Senator Jim Leddy, who represented the Chittenden District for 10 years, served for a very long time as the executive director of the Howard Center. As a member of the Vermont Senate, he chaired the Senate Health and Welfare Committee and was responsible for, among other things, the creation of Catamount Health in our state, and was at the forefront of the beginnings of what today is known as COTS here in Chittenden County. So, Senator Leddy, thank you for coming, and we'd like to hear some of your thoughts.
Thank you, Vince. I only have a couple points to make. One, take a drive by Battery Park. All you gotta do is drive by Battery Park, a showplace of Vermont, a beautiful setting in Burlington, and see what you see. As I speak today, you look at the band shell and you'll see not tents, you'll see rapids. If you drive by at night, late afternoon, you'll see people gathering because that's their home. That's where they're living, in the band shell at Battery Park. That shouldn't be. A few months ago, Channel 5 aired a two-part series highlighting the work of two people working for the Community Health Center, a social worker and a nurse, who every day got in their car and went to where the homeless are. You go down to Elmwood Avenue, the pods on Elmwood Avenue, go along the bike path, and you see tents, and you see homeless people there. Every day they went for several years in the winter cold months and provided health care to homeless people. That program isn't being funded this year. It isn't being funded. Why would you unfund a program in the coldest part of our winter, serving homeless people direct care on site with a nurse? It doesn't make sense. We have a crisis without a plan. We have leadership that's absent. Leadership is an orphan at a time of crisis. All we are calling for and asking for is that leadership be made available to the people of this state from the governor and from other leaders. We don't need to be driving by Battery Park and looking where the homeless are living. We ask for your support. We hope the governor will step up and provide some leadership. Money is only part of the answer. We have multiple organizations, each doing good work, all in their own silo. We have too many silos. We have not enough integrated services. That's what we ask and hope will change. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Representative Kate Logan. I represent the Chittenden 16 district. That's the central Old North End, downtown, part of the waterfront, and Pine Maple neighborhoods in Burlington. I also serve as the director for the Vermont Coalition of Runaway and Homeless Youth Programs, a statewide network of youth-serving agencies that receives federal funding to provide shelter, housing, and services for runaway and homeless youth from 12 to 24 years old. Vermont now has the distinction of having, after California, the second highest rate of homelessness in the country. This issue has been masked somewhat by the motel program, which we have been forced to downsize, forcing hundreds of vulnerable people into unsheltered homelessness this year. Vermonters ought to consider it completely unacceptable for there to be nowhere for someone to go when they've lost their housing. As a state, we need to make a commitment to eliminate involuntary unsheltered homelessness. Governor Scott, you must take decisive action to ensure that our social service providers and the Agency of Human Services have the resources needed to provide shelter to every Vermonter when they need it. This includes ensuring that our human services staff are paid well enough to, at a minimum, pay their own rent. The housing crisis that so many of us are currently experiencing was decades in the making and requires urgent action that is now long overdue by our political leadership. The signs have been there for years, and we have yet to see our political leadership take decisive and comprehensive actions across our housing, economic development, labor, human services, education, and healthcare sectors. Our punishing housing market has unhoused over 4,000 Vermonters so far this year, and tens of thousands of Vermonters can't afford to purchase homes or move out of affordable housing into market rate housing, meaning that we will not see an improvement in our rental housing vacancy rates or a meaningful decrease in homelessness anytime soon. Without significant systemic coordination to build more housing or make more of our existing housing stock safe and affordable, we will not see a change in our homelessness issue or our housing crisis. Governor Scott, you must take decisive action to raise the revenue that we need in order to address this crisis at its root. Most of the people who we have elected to make decisions about our housing policy have never experienced anything close to housing instability themselves, simply because they were born into economic security or have just been luckier than others. The reasons and solutions for homelessness will not be intuitive to those who have never experienced it or done the hands-on work to even help one person take the steps that they need in order to resolve their housing crisis. I urge my colleagues to not only be ready to take urgent action, but to also check our assumptions and listen to those with the lived and professional experience needed to help us develop solutions that will work. Together, we can and must take action now. And now, I'd like to introduce my senator and colleague, Senator Tanya Bohovsky, the Chittenden Central Senator.
Good morning, and thank you for being here on one of the coldest days so far this winter, when we know that there are hundreds of Vermonters who are unsheltered. This is a crisis, and it is all of our crisis. Yes, it is a crisis for those experiencing unsheltered homelessness, but it is also a crisis for our municipalities, a crisis for our state, and each of us own this crisis. Our governor owns this crisis, our legislator owns this crisis, and we own this crisis. These are our fellow Vermonters, our community members, and they deserve shelter, and they deserve care, and they deserve the support that they need to live fulfilled, full lives. We've already lost some individuals experiencing homelessness. 3 people we know have died because of the weather, and I know of 5 people who have died because they have been hit by cars trying to get to safe shelter, because the lack of transportation between the different shelter options is non-existent. These lives matter. These are our neighbors, our friends, our family members, and it could be any of us. As one of the only renter in the Senate and one of few renters in the legislature, I know that this is a systemic downstream problem. We know that people have become unsheltered because of no-cause evictions, because of soaring rents, because of an inability to buy, because of unsafe housing stock, and yet we do nothing. We finished a landlord-tenant commission study very recently, and a headline came forward saying that tenant rights were likely to see no action. This is a problem. Tenants have nowhere to go if their housing becomes unsafe or is taken off the market, or if they are evicted for no reason, and they are often exited into unsheltered homelessness. We have to do better. The governor needs to declare a state of emergency. The governor needs to take all of the powers available to him to take decisive action to ensure that every Vermonter who is sleeping outside right now does not have to do that. The legislature needs to return and be prepared to take bold action protecting tenants so more people do not become homeless. The legislature needs to think outside the box. The legislature needs to look at what other states have done, what other countries have done, and build a safe, welcoming community for every Vermonter. I am a clinical social worker when I'm not in the legislature, and I work with youth and spent many years working as a school social worker in multiple different Champlain Valley schools. I've supported students who were living in unsheltered homelessness to come to school, to try to learn, and they can't. The instability means that they need significant support simply to be in the school building safely. It means they need clothes and food and a shower, and that their peers know something isn't right. And yet the adults and the leaders in the room are doing nothing. We have to do better for our children, for our communities, for every one of our Vermont family members, neighbors. There is no simple solution to decades long of underinvestment and lack of policy, but we have to do everything within our power to ensure that this does not continue, that we do not continue to be the state with the fastest growing rate of unsheltered homelessness, that we do not continue to be the state with the second highest by a rounding error. rate of homelessness, that we do not continue to be a state that says we don't care about those members of our community. I know I care. Their lives matter, and we need to show them that. There is a lot of work we can do to protect our tenants, to protect our most vulnerable Vermonters. The governor has stood on a platform for 8 years saying he is committed to protecting the most vulnerable Vermonters. But his actions do not match his words, and it is time for him to act to protect our most vulnerable Vermonters.
Thank you, Senator Vahosky and Representative Logan, and of course Senator Leddy. The last election was framed by issues that included high property taxes and affordability. So let me for a moment talk in the language of the issues that we debated over the summer in deciding who will represent us at the State House in Montpelier. If you think about it, homelessness, if not comprehensively addressed with both short-term and long-term solutions, will continue to substantially increase the demand on state government, drag down state and regional economies, decrease public safety, and increase long-term health and education costs for those caught in the sphere of despair. Just like Vermont prides itself on early intervention with our children, it should also pride itself with a timely and robust response to the homelessness crisis that has been here, is here, and will not simply go away on its own. Vermonters should not accept as an explanation that it's somebody else's problem or someone else's fault. Today, we conclude our remarks by asking the governor to declare an emergency and some action steps I'll go over for in just a minute, and for the legislature to prioritize its respective committees that address housing to make that a priority for the 2025 legislative session. So here are some of the action steps that we're recommending. The governor, after declaring a state of emergency, put one person in charge. Now, I hate to use as an analogy the federal government as a model of efficiency in getting things done. However, there are various offices in the federal government that do essentially what we're requesting. There is a National Director of Intelligence, for example. What that person does is coordinate the various agencies and departments of the federal government to coordinate the response to national intelligence. 2, to make vouchers for motels portable so that people have an incentive to find suitable housing and free up temporary motel space. 3, to designate places for unsheltered people to go, campers, tents, RVs. The list is longer. 4, see if former local shelters run often by volunteers and closed 5 years ago because of the COVID pandemic can get back up and running, and give them some funding. As I've often said, local churches and nonprofits can often do more with less. Start repurposing state office buildings. The Scott administration should immediately begin repurposing state building space for supportive transitional housing managed by Vermont-based nonprofits, including existing regional community action agencies. State offices are in every region of the state, and many state office workers have been working from home, allowing for the repurposing of at least a part of some of those buildings. This can be a quality solution that can happen quickly. So again, our message is the governor has the authority to act on an emergency immediate basis. What about the legislature? First, to try to preserve tenancy for problem people. Task the regional homeless prevention groups with trying to prevent homelessness of challenging people as best they can. 2, local communities need to include meeting the challenge of homelessness as they're part of the planning process. Without returning to the poor farms of yesteryear, we have a tradition of working together and rebuilding our barns together. We need to take care of our own. Vermonters have always understood that and acted accordingly. 3, instead of throwing good money after bad in temporary measures, we need to bond for the infrastructure to set up long-term housing opportunities. 4, the state needs an aggressive launch of recovery houses for people who need stable support to keep on track and away from addiction. 5, since bonding is a solution that will take a couple of years to get up and running, consider small clusters of modest private soft shelters located walking distance to hot showers and flush toilets, not just tolerated but embraced and supported by local communities, churches, nonprofits, or civic groups, protecting privacy for those who decline services. And finally, the Department of Corrections needs to rethink its disastrous decision a few years ago to abandon most group transitional housing programs, closing down operations like the Phoenix House, RISE program, and many others. And finally, from those who have spent time trying to use the 211 service, what we need to do is end what we regard as silo thinking, hiding behind fig leaves, like evidenced by the recent decision by Valley Vista in Bradford and Virgins to deny residential treatment to patients on methadone because other state agencies would not fund the daily cost of transportation to a methadone clinic. The state won't solve this need is an embarrassment and an example of what must change. Programs saying you're not eligible for our program, call the other program. The other program says you're not eligible for our program, call this third program. That's what an emergency declaration can do, and that is to meld those programs who have different jurisdictions and funding sources. These are all immediate steps that should be taken. So that's it from our prepared remarks, and we'll be glad to answer questions. Thank you again.
I guess I just have, maybe it's for anybody here, and I think multiple speakers alluded to it, but the winding down of the hotels was a agreement from both the governor and Democrats in the legislature. So I'm wondering, given that the legislature controls the purse strings, how do you make the pitch to lawmakers, especially seeing for some of these initiatives, especially as there was an agreement that the hotels were too expensive? So how do you make that pitch to lawmakers that made that agreement to wind
Let's
down?
hear from a lawmaker that disagreed with that agreement.
Yes, I voted no on the budget, actually, and I stood up on the floor at approximately 1:30 in the morning on the last day of the session to say why I voted no. And part of the reason I voted no was because of the inhumane decision to unhouse thousands of Vermonters. The budget is a measure of our values, and it did not align with my values that we send people onto the streets. We need to make investments in people and in these crises in order to save money over time. Many speakers, including Senator Raluzzi, have pointed to the fact that it costs more to not make the investments in keeping people housed. And I think a lot of times we forget to look at the big picture. We forget to look at the increase in hospital and emergency room visits. We forget to look at the increase in support needs at our schools. We forget to look at what it costs to house someone in incarceration. And those costs are astronomically more than investing in supportive long-term housing now. So I think that we need to, my plea to my fellow lawmakers is to open their minds, to think outside the the bucks and look at the big picture. It is an investment in making sure that we keep people housed, and that investment will pay for itself over time. It was hard, as someone who's worked in the world of homelessness before. I worked for Pathways Vermont for a long time before I went to graduate school. And I remember the very first local interagency team meeting I went to where they were talking about the motel rooms over a decade ago. And I remember thinking that this is crazy. This is such a huge amount of money that could be invested in long-term solutions. So it was strange for me to fast forward a decade to be supporting that program. And it's not that I think it's the best program, and we do need to invest in other alternatives, but in the interim, we have to keep people housed. The alternative of spending the money on motels can't be that we're just going to send people to the streets.
As you know, there was, I think, 2 years ago, there was an effort to sustain the governor's veto on the budget if it did not include an expansion of housing for people in hotels. That did not materialize this year. Do you know why, or where did that energy go?
So while I was involved in those conversations, I was one of the only no votes in the Senate, but Representative Logan was deeply involved on the House side in bringing those votes together, so I'm actually going to turn it over to her to answer that question.
Thanks. The fact of the matter is that this year, the House intended to vote yes on the budget, and along with Republicans, we did not have a sufficient number of votes to get a majority of noes in the House. Last time, there were more issues that the House wanted to negotiate over with the governor on the budget. This time, this was the primary sticking point, and we would have had to find at least 20 Democrats who would have been willing to vote against their own party in order to give a challenge to the governor. I will say we all agree that the motel program is not the best use of our resources. It's a temporary program, very costly. It's less costly than it was when we were paying $150 a night for a hotel room, for a motel room, which seems like a tremendous waste of resources to me personally. The rooms themselves cost $20,000 to $40,000 a year. I am a social service provider. I fund, social service agencies around the state and pay rental assistance at market rate for previously homeless youth, sometimes up to 100% of the cost of that rental assistance because of the youth's income. That includes all the supportive services that they need from their own case manager, case management, housing navigation, the ability to provide things like food, help getting their car fixed, maybe cover a couple months of car insurance, maybe pay back utility bills. We do that on average about $25,000 a year. The problem is we don't have enough housing, so I understand the calculation that the legislature is trying to make. We need to reduce spending on the motel program so that we can increase investment in housing. We also had the opportunity this year, just a little while ago, to raise income by increasing income tax on all income over $500,000 by about 3%, and it was a handful of Democrats in the Senate who decided not to make. We knew the Republicans were going to vote no on that, but it was a handful of Democrats in the Senate that refused to get that over the line. Now there's just absolutely no potential for us to raise any additional revenue to build more housing, which would, of course, build our property tax base, our grand lists in our communities, and ease the burden of property tax on Vermonters. It's just going to take time, I think, for our part-time, non-professional legislature to gain understanding on this extremely complex issue in order to make good policy on it. We're in a much better place than we were just even a couple years ago in terms of understanding within the legislature on this issue, but it's been all in the context of working with a governor who refuses to take responsibility for the issue himself. He's got great staff within his agencies who would be ready to work with us to put a plan together to end homelessness in Vermont, but he needs to take responsibility for it instead of continuing to pass the buck to the part-time legislature and then blaming us when things don't go well. Thanks.
I'm 82 years old. I shouldn't be standing here 2 days before Christmas. This wasn't my plan. We have a crisis. I don't have answers, by the way. That's probably only too obvious. The reality is we have a crisis that is so visible and so painful, and we have a number of very good organizations doing very good work, each in their silo, separately, trying to solve this crisis and this problem. The answer isn't simple, and it is far more than money. It is a commitment to care for our neighbors. It is a commitment to respond here and now with leadership, which is so absent. It's an orphan. If you ask who's in charge, no one's in charge. This is a problem that requires leadership coming together, standing together, taking care of one another. You can translate that into a multitude of specific programs, but without a commitment based on caring for each other and standing together, we will never, ever address this problem. So I hope that with the governor, a good man, committed to this state, working with legislators, working with communities, that we stand together, that we don't have to drive by Battery Park and see a shelter. And that's what we look at today. When you drive, if you drive wherever you drive in Chittenden County, take a drive by Battery Park. It is the epitome of a scandal of a community and a state unwilling to step forward, stand together, and take care of one another.
Anyone else?
I have one more question. Senator Vygotsky alluded to the landlord-tenant study committee that's been meeting over the fall. I think the headline recently was that they were unable to come to consensus or have any recommendations. I mean, what did that work look like? Like, why wasn't anything able to come out of that?
So the work looked like gathering information and data from across the country about different ways that different states have tackled similar challenges. And due to we had a very limited amount of time to work. It is complex policy that has been stagnated in the State House since before I was elected. And we really just ran out of time. We were only given 6 meetings to try and solve this problem. And so what we spent our time doing was gathering the information and the data from across the country from multiple other states about different policies that have been put in place to create tenant protection and to support landlords and tenants in that relationship. And the report there's a draft report that has come out, and the final report really just looks at and summarizes all of that data and puts forward additional questions that need to be answered. It was certainly frustrating for me that we were not able to get to a point where we were putting forward policy suggestions. That's not going to stop me from putting forward policy suggestions. I will be putting forward an omnibus tenant protection bill, as well as a couple of other housing bills meant to create and sustain affordable housing. But that committee, again, I think it really came down to time. and not having enough time to really dig into and debate the issue. You know, we had to start by laying the groundwork for what is the issue and what are the possible solutions, and we simply ran out of time to do the debate and conversation around what would we like to put forward. So my hope is that we'll take that data and we'll take that information and the testimony that we heard in the 6 meetings of that committee, and we'll continue to do the work in the legislative session this year. And as I said earlier, my hope is that my colleagues will keep an open mind, knowing that we have to do something. We are clearly in a housing crisis. Doing nothing isn't an option.
Okay,
Can I say something as a citizen?
sure.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, my family has owned a real estate company for like 50 years, and I'm in my 70s. These are great people working, they're angels. But the state does not have revenue coming in, so they have to become the landlord. They have to become a landlord, and they will be getting money coming in, just like across the street. They got the Holiday Inn, they got millions of dollars during the pandemic. We have to buy hotels or apartment houses, the state. And because you can't blame Governor Scott and the legislature, because they're working with so much money. And unless we can get the workers, I've been trained for several jobs in my life. The state workers can man these hotels or whatever state buildings can be turned into housing. And they can be trained to do that. There's plenty of state workers. So it's an easy concept. I'm going to say it again, the state of Vermont has to become a landlord. My family has owned properties and collected rents, and it's always a win-win. So yeah, you have to do that. And like I said, I've also volunteered many times for the homeless. I've gotten them sleeping bags, tents, and my church in Burlington was just approached to help the homeless. They want them to do some kind of housing, and they had to say no. They don't have the revenue either. They're trying to keep their parishioners, their tithes every month, and a lot of them don't want it to house the homeless. Their heart's there, but they can't afford it. So that's what I wanted to say.
And I'd like to say, listen, you folks, I know you mean well for everybody, but when are these people going to stand on their own 2 feet, just like you folks are working for a living? I work for a living. Everybody else out here works for a living. Why do we have to babysit these people? Okay? Some people don't have, I understand that. They might not have the comfort, or I'm not sure how I'm wording it, but stand on your own 2 feet. We had to get out and make a living. We had to pay our mortgage. We had to pay our bills. Why do we continue to have to pay for these people? That are they willing to work, or are they able to work? Okay, because the welfare it's getting ridiculous. Now we have to stand out and pay for these hotels for these people? Come on.
I think one of the common misconceptions about people experiencing homelessness is that they're unwilling to work. More than 50% of people who are experiencing homelessness
There's a lot of
have
jobs out
full-time
there.
jobs.
There's
So
a lot
we
of
have
jobs
an
out there.
affordability crisis. And to your point, one of the bills that I am introducing would be for the state to bond and build and manage social housing. So I agree with you wholeheartedly that we need to shift the narrative about who is doing what.
So we're at the end of our press conference. We handed out some documents that indicate the state of Hawaii and a number of major cities across America have declared emergencies to facilitate implementation of both emergency and short-term changes to address the homeless crisis we